Welcome to Manuela's Story Library. Manuela's Story Library, where every story finds a home. Hello, dear friends. I'm so glad you're here with me today because I have a story that will take your breath away. This is a tale of danger and destiny, of a curse that has haunted one of Naples' most powerful families for generations, and of a simple waitress whose courage at a wedding altar changed everything. Imagine standing before a man so powerful that his mere presence commands silence, a man who has buried 3 wives before their first anniversary, and being asked to become the 4th. Would you dare? Would you accept a contract marriage with a deadline written in blood? Today's story is about Giulia Romano, a woman who had nothing to lose and everything to gain, and Matteo Santoro, a mafia boss who didn't believe in curses until they destroyed everyone he tried to love. But here's what will keep you on the edge of your seat. The curse wasn't supernatural at all. It was murder. Calculated, methodical murder. And Giulia is about to uncover a conspiracy that goes deeper than anyone could imagine. Stay with me until the very end, because the person behind it all will shock you. This is Every Mafia Bride Dies Within a Year, until the waitress who broke the curse at the altar. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of the Villa Santoro, painting the marble floors in shades of amber and gold. Matteo Santoro stood in his office, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand, staring at the portrait of his father that dominated the wall behind his massive mahogany desk. At 42, Matteo had become everything his father had groomed him to be: ruthless in business, calculating in strategy, feared by enemies and respected by allies. The tattoos that covered his arms and chest told the story of his life in the Santoro family, each symbol a chapter of violence, loyalty, and power. But there was one story his skin didn't tell, one that haunted him more than any enemy ever could. The story of the 3 women who had died wearing his ring. The first bride, Alessandra, had been a love match, or as close to love as a man like Matteo could afford. She died in a car accident 3 months after their wedding. The second, Francesca, had been chosen by his family for political alliance. She fell down the grand staircase at 6 months of marriage. The third, Valentina, lasted almost the full year before succumbing to what the doctors called a sudden heart failure. Each death had been ruled an accident or natural causes. Each funeral had been attended by hundreds. Each time, whispers of the Santoro curse had grown louder in the streets of Naples. Now, tradition demanded he marry again. The Santoro bloodline needed an heir. The family needed stability. And Matteo, despite his personal feelings, understood duty above all else. He had chosen Bianca Moretti, the daughter of a Neapolitan wine merchant, not because he loved her, but because she was practical, quiet, and came from a family with no ties to the underworld. Perhaps, he reasoned, a bride who had no connection to his world would escape the fate of the others. The wedding was to take place at the family's private chapel, a Baroque masterpiece dating back to the 18th century. 300 guests had been invited, and an army of staff had been hired to manage the elaborate celebration. Among them was Giulia Romano, a 28-year-old waitress from the Trattoria Bella Vita, a small family restaurant near the port. Giulia had been working double shifts for months, taking every catering job she could find. Her younger sister, Sofia, was in the hospital with leukemia, and the medical bills were drowning them both. When the opportunity to work the Santoro wedding came up, promising a week's worth of normal wages for a single night, Giulia didn't hesitate. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Naples knew about the Santoro curse. But curses were for people who had the luxury of superstition. Giulia believed in things she could touch, count, and fight. She believed in working hard, in protecting the people she loved, and in surviving whatever life threw at her. The Santoro family and their curse belonged to a world so far removed from hers that they might as well have been fiction. The day of the wedding arrived with the kind of brilliant sunshine that made the Bay of Naples look like liquid sapphire. The Villa Santoro had been transformed into a vision of white roses and gold ribbons. The chapel, with its frescoed ceiling and stained glass windows, glowed with candlelight. Julia arrived early with the other catering staff, dressed in the standard uniform of white shirt, black skirt, and black apron. She pulled her long chestnut hair into a neat bun and checked that the simple gold cross her grandmother had given her was tucked safely beneath her collar. It was her only piece of real jewelry, the only thing of her past she carried with her always. As the guests began to arrive, Julia found herself caught up in the controlled chaos of high society service. She moved through the crowds with trays of champagne and delicate appetizers, keeping her eyes down and her movements efficient. She had learned long ago that being invisible was a survival skill. Rich people rarely looked at servers, and that anonymity was exactly what she needed to get through the evening without incident. But invisibility has a strange way of making you observant. When no one looks at you, you see everything. And Julia saw something that made her blood run cold. The bride, Bianca Moretti, was a pale, delicate woman in her mid-30s, her dark hair styled in elaborate waves, her designer gown a confection of silk and lace that probably cost more than Julia would make in 5 years. She stood in a private room adjacent to the chapel, surrounded by her bridesmaids and family members, sipping from a crystal glass of champagne. Julia had been assigned to ensure that the bridal party's glasses remained full, a task she performed with practiced invisibility. She was refilling one of the bridesmaids' glasses when she noticed something odd. One of the men who had entered the room, a handsome man in his late 30s with charm radiating from every gesture, had handed Bianca a fresh glass of champagne. He had smiled, made a toast to her happiness, and departed before anyone could engage him in conversation. Something about the exchange had felt wrong to Julia, though she couldn't have explained why. Perhaps it was the way his smile hadn't reached his eyes. Perhaps it was how quickly he'd left after delivering the glass. Or perhaps it was simply instinct, that street-smart awareness that came from growing up with nothing and learning to read danger in the tilt of a head or the tension in a shoulder. When Bianca raised the glass to her lips, preparing for another sip, Julia found herself moving before her brain could stop her. She crossed the room in 3 quick steps and knocked the glass from Bianca's hand. Crystal shattered against marble. Champagne pooled like pale gold blood across the floor. The room fell into shocked silence. "Don't drink it," Julia heard herself saying, her voice steadier than she felt. "There's something wrong with it." The bridesmaids stared at her with expressions ranging from confusion to outrage. Bianca's mother stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "What on earth do you think you're doing? How dare you?" "Call a doctor," Julia interrupted, her eyes fixed on Bianca's face. The bride had gone even paler, one hand pressed to her throat. "Call a doctor right now. She's already had some of it." What happened next occurred in rapid succession. Bianca collapsed. Screaming erupted. Someone ran for help. In the chaos, Julia knelt beside the fallen bride and did the only thing she could think of. She forced Bianca to vomit, using the crude but effective method her grandmother had taught her when she was a child and had eaten poisonous berries. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. By the time medical help arrived, Bianca was conscious but disoriented. The champagne that had spilled on the floor was collected for analysis, and Julia found herself being escorted, not gently, out of the bridal chamber and toward a confrontation she had never imagined. Matteo Santoro had been standing at the altar, his brothers and closest men arranged beside him, when the news reached him. His intended bride had been poisoned. The wedding was off, and a waitress had somehow prevented what would have been his 4th wife's death. He listened to the report with his characteristic stillness, his dark eyes revealing nothing. But inside, something shifted. After 3 deaths that everyone had attributed to a curse, here was concrete proof: poison, murder. Someone had been killing his wives, and he had been too blinded by grief and superstition to see it. "Bring the girl to my office," he said quietly. "Now." Julia was terrified and trying very hard not to show it. She had been placed in a chair in what was clearly the private office of Matteo Santoro himself, surrounded by armed men whose expressions suggested they would be happy to kill her if their boss gave the word. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her chin up, and reminded herself that she had done nothing wrong. She had saved a life. If they wanted to punish her for that, then at least Sofia would understand why her sister never came home. When Matteo Santoro entered the room, Giulia understood immediately why people feared him. He was tall, powerfully built, and moved with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. His tailored suit fit him like a second skin, the jacket open to reveal the elaborate tattoos that covered his chest and neck, visible above the open collar of his black silk shirt. His dark eyes, nearly black in the dim light of the office, fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel like prey being assessed by a predator. A thin scar cut through his left eyebrow, a pale line that somehow made his handsome face more dangerous rather than less. He dismissed everyone else from the room with a gesture. When they were alone, he circled around to sit behind his desk, steepling his fingers as he studied her. "Tell me exactly what you saw," he said. His voice was deep, accented with the musical rhythm of Naples, but controlled and cold. Giulia told him everything. The man who had brought the champagne, the way he'd left so quickly, the instinct that had made her act. Matteo listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he asked, "Do you believe in curses, Miss Romano?" "No," Giulia answered honestly. "I believe in people, and people can be poisonous all on their own." Something that might have been approval flickered across his face. "You saved Bianca's life tonight. That makes you either very brave or very stupid. I haven't decided which. Does it matter?" Giulia found courage she didn't know she had. "Your bride is alive. Isn't that what's important?" "My bride has fled," Matteo said flatly. "She left the estate 20 minutes ago, convinced that marrying me will guarantee her death. She's not wrong to think so." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving Giulia's face. 3 wives, Miss Romano. 3 dead wives in 5 years. Tonight, you proved what I should have realized long ago. They weren't accidents. Someone in my organization, someone I trust, has been murdering the women I marry." The weight of that statement hung in the air between them. Giulia felt her heartbeat accelerate. "Then you need to find out who." "I will," Matteo said with absolute certainty. "But that presents me with a problem. Tradition demands that I marry. The family demands an heir. And now everyone knows that marriage to me is a death sentence. What woman would agree to such a thing?" Giulia said nothing, sensing that this question was rhetorical. She was proven right when Matteo continued, his eyes boring into hers with unnerving focus. "Unless that woman had something to gain that was worth the risk. Unless that woman was smart enough, brave enough, and desperate enough to take a gamble." Understanding crashed over Giulia like a cold wave. "No," she said immediately. "No, absolutely not. I haven't made my offer yet. I don't need to hear it. The answer is no." Matteo leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "1 year, Miss Romano. Be my wife for 1 year. If you survive, I will pay you 10 million euros. More money than you could earn in several lifetimes. Enough to save your sister and secure both your futures forever. All you have to do is live in my house, play the role of my wife in public, and help me identify who wants me to remain heirless badly enough to kill for it." Giulia's mind reeled. 10 million euros. Sofia's treatment, the experimental therapy the doctors said was her only real chance, cost 300,000. That was money Giulia would never have, could never earn. She had been considering selling everything she owned, taking loans from people she shouldn't owe money to, and even that wouldn't be enough. But 10 million euros, that would save Sofia. That would give her baby sister a life. "You're insane," she whispered. "Probably," Matteo agreed. "But I'm also serious, and I think you're smart enough to understand what I'm offering you. A chance. For both of us." "Why me?" Giulia demanded. "Why would you choose a waitress? Someone with no connections, no protection, no connection to my world," Matteo interrupted. "That's exactly why. Every bride I've chosen has come from families within the organization or connected to it. Every death has been written off as the curse. But you, Miss Romano, you're nobody. He said it without cruelty, simply stating a fact. You don't fit the pattern. Whoever is killing my wives won't expect you. And that unexpected element might just keep you alive long enough for us to catch them. You're using me as bait, Julia realized. I'm offering you a contract, Matteo corrected. Be honest, Miss Romano. You came to work my wedding because you need money desperately. How much do you need? What drives you to work yourself to exhaustion? Julia's jaw tightened. She didn't want to give him this information, this piece of ammunition, but she also knew he could find it out easily enough if he wanted. My sister is sick, leukemia. She needs treatment that I can't afford. Matteo nodded slowly. I will pay for your sister's treatment immediately. The best doctors, the best facility, whatever she needs. That's separate from the 10 million. Consider it a signing bonus. All you have to do is say yes. Tears burned behind Julia's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This man was offering her everything she needed, but the cost might be her life. Could she do it? Could she walk into certain danger for money? The answer came to her with startling clarity. For Sophia, she would walk through fire. 1 year, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And you protect my sister. If something happens to me, you make sure she's taken care of. That's non-negotiable. Agreed. Matteo stood and extended his hand across the desk. Do we have a deal, Miss Romano? Julia looked at his hand, at the ornate signet ring that bore the Santoro crest, at the tattoos that marked him as a man of violence and power. Then she thought of Sophia in that hospital bed, of the light slowly fading from her eyes as the disease consumed her. She stood and placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, strong, and surprisingly gentle. We have a deal, Mr. Santoro. Matteo, he corrected. If you're going to be my wife, you should use my name. The wedding took place 3 days later, in a ceremony so different from the elaborate celebration that had been planned that they might as well have been different events entirely. This time, there were only 20 witnesses, Matteo's closest men, his consigliere Isabella Costa, his brothers Lorenzo and Marco, and the priest who had served the Santoro family for 3 decades. Julia wore a simple white dress that Isabella had procured for her, elegant but not extravagant. No bridesmaids, no flowers, no champagne. Just vows spoken in the chapel where 3 other women had promised their lives to Matteo Santoro. Julia had spent those 3 days in a strange state of surreal preparation. Isabella Costa, a woman in her late 40s with steel-gray eyes and an air of quiet authority, had taken charge of transforming Julia from a waitress into a Mafia bride. There were lessons in etiquette, in the complex web of family relationships and alliances, in the unspoken rules of the world Julia was entering. Isabella was patient but thorough, and Julia sensed that beneath the woman's cold exterior was something like approval, though Isabella never spoke it aloud. You're smarter than the others, Isabella had told her during one of their sessions. That might just save your life. Matteo, for his part, had kept his distance. After their initial agreement, he had conducted everything through Isabella. The contracts were drawn up and signed. Sophia was transferred to a private medical facility in Naples, one of the best in Europe, where a team of specialists immediately began the aggressive treatment protocol that was her only hope. Julia had been allowed to visit her sister once to explain what was happening, though she left out most of the truth. Sophia, weak but still sharp, had looked at her with those identical green eyes and whispered, "You're sacrificing yourself for me, aren't you?" "I'm saving us both," Julia had replied, kissing her sister's forehead. "I'm going to be fine, Sophie. I promise." Now, standing at the altar beside Matteo Santoro, Julia wondered if that promise had been a lie. The priest spoke the ancient words of the ceremony, and Julia responded by rote, her voice steady even though her hands trembled. When it came time to exchange rings, Matteo slipped a band onto her finger, a simple platinum circle that felt like a shackle. She did the same for him, her fingers brushing against his warm skin. "You may kiss the bride," the priest intoned. Matteo turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face. Then he leaned in and kissed her, a brief, formal touch of lips that nonetheless sent an unexpected jolt through Julia's system. His lips were warm, and for just a second, his hand came to rest against her lower back, a gesture that felt almost protective. Then it was over, and they were married. The wedding party moved to the villa's dining room for a modest lunch, though Julia barely tasted the food. She sat beside Matteo at the head of the long table, hyper-aware of every glance, every whispered comment. Lorenzo Santoro, Matteo's younger brother, was particularly attentive, his golden brown eyes fixed on her with an expression that might have been curiosity, or might have been something more calculating. He was handsome in a different way than Matteo, more polished and charming. But something about his constant smile made Julia uncomfortable. "Welcome to the family, sister," Lorenzo said, raising his glass to her. "I hope you'll be very happy here. For as long as you're with us." The emphasis on those last words made Julia's skin crawl, but she smiled and nodded. Beside her, she felt Matteo tense almost imperceptibly. "Lorenzo," Matteo said quietly, but there was a warning in his tone that made his brother's smile falter. "Just a toast, brother," Lorenzo said easily. "No harm meant." After the lunch, Matteo took Julia on a tour of the villa. The house was enormous, a maze of elegant rooms filled with priceless antiques and modern luxuries. Her room, he explained, was in the east wing, while his was in the west. They would maintain separate spaces, as their marriage was a business arrangement, not a romantic one. Julia was relieved by this information, though a small, traitorous part of her felt something that might have been disappointment. "There are rules you need to understand," Matteo told her as they stood in the villa's impressive library, surrounded by shelves that climbed 2 stories high. "You don't go anywhere without security. You don't eat or drink anything that hasn't been tested first. You trust no one completely, not even the people who seem most loyal to me. Someone in this house, or someone close to this house, is a killer. Until we identify them, you're in constant danger." "How do we find them?" Julia asked. "We watch, we wait, we make them nervous, and we investigate." Matteo moved to a portrait on the wall, pressing a section of the frame. A hidden panel swung open, revealing a small room beyond. "This is my real office. The one downstairs is for show. This is where I keep the records that matter, the information that could destroy or save this family. You'll need to familiarize yourself with it all." Over the following weeks, Julia learned more about the Santoro family than she had ever wanted to know. With Isabella's help, she traced the history of each bride who had died. Alessandra had been killed in a car accident, but the mechanic who serviced Matteo's vehicles had died under suspicious circumstances 3 days after giving testimony about the brake failure. Francesca's fall down the stairs had been witnessed only by household staff, all of whom had been paid handsomely and then relocated to different Santoro properties shortly after. Valentina's heart failure had occurred after a family dinner, but the medical examiner who performed the autopsy had noted irregularities that were dismissed as complications from an undiagnosed condition. Each death had a thread, a tiny inconsistency that no one had investigated because everyone had been so willing to believe in a curse. It made Julia furious. These women had been murdered, and the superstition had been their killer's perfect cover. But finding a pattern was one thing. Identifying the killer was another. The more Julia learned about the Santoro organization, the more she realized how many people had motives. Matteo's position as head of the family made him powerful but also vulnerable. There were rival families who would benefit from his instability. There were members of his own organization who might covet his position. And there was the complexity of family dynamics, of old grudges and new ambitions. Lorenzo remained at the top of Julia's suspect list, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. He was charming and seemed genuinely affectionate toward Matteo, but there was something performative about it, something calculated. He visited the villa often, always with a smile and a story, always asking Julia how she was adjusting to her new life. His attention felt less like friendliness and more like surveillance. Matteo, for his part, was maddeningly difficult to read. He was courteous but distant, treating Julia with the same formal respect he might show a business associate. They had dinner together most evenings, a requirement for maintaining the appearance of a real marriage, but the conversations remained superficial. He asked about her day, she asked about his, and neither of them ventured into more personal territory. It was frustrating in a way Julia hadn't expected. She had married him for money, for Sophia's life, and yet she found herself wanting to understand him, to break through the wall he had built so carefully around himself. It was Isabella who finally provided insight. One evening, after another stiff dinner where Matteo had excused himself immediately after the last course, Julia found the older woman in the villa's small conservatory, tending to an orchid collection. "He's afraid," Isabella said without preamble, as if she'd been expecting Julia. "Of what?" Julia asked, settling into a chair. "He doesn't seem afraid of anything. He's afraid of caring for you." Isabella pruned a delicate stem with precise movements. "Every woman he's allowed himself to feel anything for has died. Alessandra, he loved. Her death nearly destroyed him. Francesca, he respected and was beginning to care for. Valentina, he tried to keep at arm's length, but she was kind and made him laugh. Each time he thought the distance would protect them. Each time he was wrong." Julia absorbed this information, feeling something shift in her understanding of the man she'd married. "So he's decided that keeping me at a distance will keep me alive." "Yes, and he might be right. Whoever is doing this chooses victims they believe will hurt Matteo most. You, a waitress, a nobody, as he put it. You shouldn't matter to him. If you remain just a contract, just a business arrangement, perhaps the killer will wait, watch, and will catch them. But if I become more than that, then you move to the top of the target list immediately." Isabella looked at Julia with something that might have been sympathy. "So the question is, can you live with him, be married to him, and never allow it to become real? Because if you can't, if you develop real feelings or if he does, you're signing your own death warrant." The words haunted Julia, but she was determined to maintain the professional distance Isabella advised. She threw herself into the investigation, spending hours in Matteo's hidden office, poring over files and financial records. She interviewed staff members under the guise of wanting to learn about the villa's history. She observed every interaction at the family dinners Matteo hosted monthly, noting who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, who watched with calculating eyes. 2 months into the marriage, Julia made her first significant discovery. She found a series of payments, small enough to be overlooked, made from a secondary Santoro account to a pharmaceutical company that specialized in exotic and difficult-to-trace toxins. The payments coincided with the weeks leading up to each bride's death. The account was controlled by only 3 people: Matteo, Isabella, and Lorenzo. When Julia brought this information to Matteo, she found him in the library, reading by the light of a single lamp. It was late, well past midnight, and she hadn't expected him to still be awake. "I found something," she said, closing the door behind her. Matteo looked up, and for a moment, his guard dropped. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes more pronounced than usual. "Show me." She laid out the documents she'd compiled, explaining the pattern she'd found. As Matteo studied the papers, his expression grew darker. "This is good work," he said finally. "Very good work. You're certain about the timing?" "I've checked it 3 times. The purchases align with the deaths within a week or 2 each time." "Lorenzo," Matteo said quietly. "You think it's Lorenzo? He has access to the account. He had opportunity with all 3 wives. And if you die without an heir, the leadership of the family would eventually fall to him." Julia hesitated, then added, "But I need you to consider the possibility that it could be Isabella. She also has access." "No." Matteo's response was immediate. "Isabella has been with my family since before I was born. She was my mother's closest friend. She has no motive. Everyone has a motive if you look hard enough, Julia countered. I'm not saying it's her. I'm saying we can't rule anyone out. Matteo stood abruptly, pacing to the window. You don't understand the kind of loyalty Isabella has shown. She's sacrificed everything for this family. Her own marriage, her own children, her entire life has been in service to the Santoros. And maybe she's tired of that, Julia suggested gently. Maybe she wants something more. Maybe she thinks you're not the leader your father was. I don't know, Matteo. I'm just asking you to keep an open mind. He turned to face her, and the raw pain in his expression made Julia's breath catch. If I suspect everyone, if I trust no one, what does that make me? Careful, Julia answered. And careful is what keeps you alive. Something passed between them in that moment, a connection that went beyond their contractual arrangement. Matteo crossed the room and, to Julia's surprise, took her hand. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, a gesture so gentle it sent warmth flooding through her. You could have just taken the money and played your part, he said quietly. Instead, you're risking yourself to help me find the truth. Why? Because I'm starting to care about you, Julia thought. But she couldn't say it. Isabella's warning echoed in her mind. If you develop real feelings, you're signing your own death warrant. Because it's the right thing to do, she said instead. And because I'm invested now. I'd like to live to collect that 10 million euros. Matteo smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his face. Then we'll make sure you do. The investigation intensified after that night. Matteo began to include Julia in more of his business, using her as a fresh pair of eyes to spot inconsistencies. She accompanied him to meetings, sat in on conference calls, and slowly built her own understanding of how the Santoro Empire functioned. The other members of the family watched her with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity, but none more intently than Lorenzo. It was at a family dinner in Julia's third month as Matteo's wife that Lorenzo finally made his move. The evening had been pleasant enough, with Marco, the middle Santoro brother, entertaining everyone with stories of his recent trip to Rome. Julia was beginning to relax, to feel like perhaps she could survive this year after all, when Lorenzo leaned close to her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You're very good at playing the devoted wife, he said, smiling. But I wonder how devoted you really are. Tell me, Julia, what does a man have to pay to make a woman risk her life? What are you really worth? Julia felt her blood run cold, but she kept her expression neutral. I don't know what you mean. Of course you do. This isn't a real marriage. Everyone knows it. My brother needed a wife and you needed money. It's a transaction. I just wonder what happens when the transaction is complete. Does he pay you to leave? Does he pay you to stay? Or does he pay you to die like all the others? That's enough. Matteo's voice cut across the table like a blade. The conversation around them died instantly. Lorenzo, a word. Now. The brothers left the dining room together, and the remaining guests shifted uncomfortably. Isabella caught Julia's eye and gave a subtle nod, a gesture of approval that suggested Julia had handled Lorenzo's provocation exactly right by remaining calm. When Matteo returned alone 20 minutes later, his expression was thunderous. He didn't return to his seat. Instead, he extended his hand to Julia. We're leaving, but dinner is over. His tone brooked no argument. Julia took his hand and let him lead her from the room. They went to his office, the public one, where he poured himself a substantial amount of whiskey and drank it in one swallow. Then he poured another and handed it to Julia. Drink, he ordered. She did, the alcohol burning down her throat. What did you say to him? I told him that if he ever spoke to you that way again, brother or not, I would put a bullet in him myself. Matteo's hands were shaking slightly, a rare display of emotion. He's jealous. He's always been jealous. When we were children, when my father chose me as his heir instead of him, something in Lorenzo broke. He learned to hide it, to smile and play the loyal brother. But it's always been there. He's dangerous, Julia said quietly. Yes. Matteo looked at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes stole her breath. Which is why I need to get you out of here. This was a mistake. I thought I could protect you, that I could solve this before anyone else got hurt. But I was wrong. I'm sending you away, somewhere Lorenzo and anyone else involved can't reach you. Sophia can go with you. I'll pay out the full amount of our contract, and you can start a new life somewhere safe. No. The word came out more forcefully than Julia intended. I'm not leaving. Julia? I said no, Matteo. She set down her glass and moved closer to him. We're close to the truth. I can feel it. If I disappear now, whoever is doing this will know they've won. They'll wait a few months, choose you another bride, and kill her too. This has to end, not just for me, but for every woman who might come after me. You could die, Matteo said, his voice raw. I have buried 3 wives, Julia. I cannot. I will not bury you. The admission hung between them, heavy with meaning. Julia reached out and placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palm. Then we make sure you don't have to. We finish this. Together. Matteo covered her hand with his own, and for a long moment they stood like that, connected by touch and by something neither of them was ready to name. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest with a fierce protectiveness that made Julia's eyes burn with unshed tears. If anything happens to you, he whispered into her hair, it will destroy me. Then make sure nothing happens, Julia whispered back. The next morning, everything changed. Julia woke to find Isabella standing beside her bed, her usually composed face pale and drawn. Get dressed, Isabella said urgently. Quickly. Don't ask questions. Julia threw on clothes and followed Isabella through the villa's winding corridors. They descended a staircase Julia had never used before, one that led deep beneath the house to the old wine cellars that had been converted into something else entirely. A security command center filled with monitors and computer equipment. Matteo was there, along with 3 of his most trusted men. They were watching footage on one of the screens, and what Julia saw made her stomach turn. It was surveillance video from the villa's kitchen, time-stamped from 2 nights ago. A figure moved through the frame, their face obscured by darkness, but their actions were clear. They were tampering with food, adding something to a covered dish. That was meant for you, Matteo said without turning. The chef who prepared your breakfast yesterday was found dead this morning, made to look like suicide. Who was it? Julia demanded. Who's on the video? We can't tell from the angle. But we have something better. Matteo finally looked at her, and his expression was grim. The substance they used wasn't as carefully chosen this time. They were rushing, getting sloppy. It's traceable. And Isabella just confirmed that another payment was made from that secondary account 2 days ago, to the same pharmaceutical company. Lorenzo, Julia breathed. I need proof, Matteo said. Absolute proof. Because if I move against my own brother without it, I'll tear this family apart. But I also won't risk your life while I gather evidence. So here's what's going to happen. Tonight, we're hosting a dinner. Formal. You, me, Lorenzo, Marco, Isabella, and a few others. And we're going to force Lorenzo's hand. The dinner was an elaborate affair held in the villa's grandest dining room. The one with frescoed ceilings and walls lined with portraits of Santoro ancestors. Julia wore a dress Isabella had selected, emerald green to match her eyes, elegant and expensive. She looked like she belonged in this world now, a transformation that would have amazed her 3 months ago. But appearances, she had learned, were often the best weapons. Lorenzo arrived in high spirits, charming as always. He kissed Julia's hand and complimented her appearance, as if their last conversation had never happened. Throughout the meal, he entertained the table with stories, poured wine for the guests, played the perfect brother and host. But Julia watched him carefully, noting the calculating way his eyes moved from person to person, assessing, evaluating, planning. It was during dessert that Matteo made his move. He stood, raising his glass, and the room fell silent. I have an announcement, Matteo said. Julia is pregnant. The words detonated like a bomb. Julia managed to keep her expression joyful and surprised, as they had rehearsed, even as her mind reeled. This was the trap. A heir. The one thing that would make her death not just desirable to someone who wanted to prevent Matteo from having children, but essential. Around the table, reactions varied. Marco looked genuinely delighted. Isabella smiled serenely, though her eyes held approval for the strategy. And Lorenzo went very still. His smile remained fixed, but something flickered behind his eyes, something dark and calculating. Congratulations, brother, Lorenzo said, rising to embrace Matteo. This is wonderful news. An heir for the family. We should celebrate. The party continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Julia played her part, accepting congratulations and fielding questions about due dates with lies they had carefully prepared. All the while, she watched Lorenzo watching her, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had just painted a target on her back. That night, security around Julia tripled. Matteo moved her to a room adjacent to his own, connected by a door that remained unlocked. He stationed his most trusted men throughout the villa, and Isabella personally oversaw the preparation of all food and drink. They were ready for Lorenzo to make a move. What none of them expected was how quickly it would come. 2 days after the announcement, Julia woke in the middle of the night to find someone standing at the foot of her bed. In the moonlight filtering through the curtains, she could see it was a man, tall and broad-shouldered. For one terrifying moment, she thought it was Lorenzo. Then he moved closer, and she saw it was Matteo. Get up, he whispered urgently. We have to move. Now. Julia didn't waste time with questions. She grabbed the robe Isabella had left for her and followed Matteo out of the room. He led her through the villa with swift, sure steps, down to the hidden office behind the library. Once inside, he locked the door and activated a security system that made the walls hum with electronic protection. What happened? Julia demanded. Lorenzo just tried to enter your room. The guard stopped him. He had a syringe, Julia, filled with the same toxin we identified from the previous payments. Matteo's face was pale with rage and something that might have been fear. He's under arrest now. My men have him. But he wasn't working alone. What do you mean? The accounts show 2 sets of withdrawals. One set matches Lorenzo's access times, but there's another set, smaller, that don't match his patterns. Someone else has been helping him. And until we identify who, you're not safe. They spent the rest of the night in the hidden office, going through files, financial records, security logs. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold visible through the office's small window, Julia found it. A pattern so subtle she had missed it before. Payments made to offshore accounts that corresponded with household purchases. Small amounts, easily overlooked, but consistent. And the authorization codes traced back to someone Julia had never suspected. It's not Isabella, Julia said slowly, her blood turning to ice. But it's someone close to her. Someone who has access to her accounts. Who? Matteo demanded. Julia looked up at him, and she saw her own realization mirrored in his eyes. Your father's lawyer, Dante Ricci. He's been managing the family's legal affairs for 30 years. He has access to everything, and Lorenzo would have needed legal help to structure the offshore accounts. Matteo was already on his phone, barking orders. Within an hour, they had confirmation. Dante Ricci had been arrested at his home, trying to burn documents. In his office, they found evidence of a 20-year conspiracy. Dante had been embezzling from the Santoro family since Matteo's father was alive, siphoning millions into hidden accounts. When Matteo became head of the family and began modernizing the financial systems, Dante realized it was only a matter of time before his theft was discovered. His solution had been to prevent Matteo from producing an heir who would inherit his leadership role, and to work with Lorenzo, who he could control, to eventually take over the family. The 3 wives hadn't died because of a curse. They had died because they were obstacles in a long game of greed and power. Lorenzo, when confronted with the evidence, broke down. He confessed to being the one who physically administered the poisons, but claimed Dante had manipulated him, convinced him that Matteo was weak and that the family needed stronger leadership. It was a coward's defense, and no one in the room believed his claims of innocence. But it hardly mattered. Both men would face the Santoro family's justice, which was far more final than any court's ruling. In the aftermath, as the villa slowly returned to normal, Julia found herself standing in the garden, looking out at the Bay of Naples. The Vesuvius loomed in the distance, a reminder that even the most beautiful places could harbor devastating power. She had survived. Against all odds, she had lived through her year as Matteo Santoro's wife. The curse was broken, the conspirators identified, and Sofia was recovering well from her treatment. Julia had fulfilled her contract and then some. Matteo found her there, as she had known he would. He stood beside her in silence for a long moment before speaking. "The year is complete," he said quietly. "You're free to go if you want. The money has been transferred to your account, along with a substantial bonus for your help in uncovering the truth. Sofia's medical care will continue to be covered for the rest of her life. You have everything I promised you." "And what do you have?" Julia asked, turning to face him. "My life. My family's honor. Justice for 3 women who deserved better." Matteo's dark eyes searched her face. "And a marriage that was never supposed to be real. But it is real," Julia said softly. "The marriage license is legal. The vows were spoken. And somewhere along the way, this stopped being just a contract." "I know," Matteo admitted. "I tried to keep you at a distance. I tried to protect you by not caring. But I failed, Julia. I failed completely. And now I have to let you go because it's what's right. You deserve a normal life, a real life, with someone who can give you safety and peace." Julia laughed, but there were tears in her eyes. "I was a waitress working 3 jobs to save my dying sister. I had no safety, no peace, no future. You gave me all of that. And you gave me something I never expected. You. Matteo Santoro, the most feared man in Naples, who reads poetry when he thinks no one is watching, who has nightmares about the wives he couldn't save, who loves his family even when they betray him. I fell in love with you somewhere between the investigation and the conspiracy, between the fear and the fighting. And I'm not leaving unless you tell me you don't want me to stay." Matteo closed the distance between them in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms. "Don't leave," he whispered against her hair. "Stay. Not for a year, not for money, but because you want to. Because I love you too, and I can't imagine my life without you in it." "Then I'll stay," Julia promised. He kissed her then, not the formal kiss of their wedding day, but a real kiss, deep and passionate and full of all the emotions they had held back for so long. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "We'll do it right this time," Matteo said. "A real wedding. Your choice of everything. I'll even let you invite that entire restaurant staff from the Bella Vita if you want." "They would love that," Julia laughed. Then she grew serious. "But I need you to promise me something. Anything. No more secrets. No more keeping me at a distance to protect me. We face things together, whatever comes, as real partners." "As real partners," Matteo agreed. "And as for that fake pregnancy we announced at the dinner? What about it? Perhaps we should work on making it real." The smile he gave her was wicked and warm and completely unguarded. "After all, the family does need an heir. And I find I very much like the idea of a house full of little girls with your courage and your eyes." Julia felt joy bubble up in her chest, bright and overwhelming. "Girls? What if we have boys? Then they'll be raised to respect women, to value courage over violence, and to understand that true power comes from knowing when to fight and when to protect." Matteo pulled her close again. "But first, Signora Santoro, we have a curse to officially declare broken. The whole city believes our marriage survived when all others failed. Let's give them a reason to believe in happy endings." Over the following months, That's exactly what they did. A second wedding was planned, this time a true celebration with Julia's friends and family in attendance. Sophia, now in remission and growing stronger every day, served as maid of honor. The entire neighborhood where Julia had grown up was invited, along with the staff from the Bella Vita who had worked alongside her for years. It was a wedding that bridged two worlds, the powerful Santoro family and the ordinary people of Naples, united in celebration of a love that had grown from the strangest of circumstances. Isabella, who had remained a loyal friend and advisor throughout, took Julia aside before the ceremony. "You did something I never thought possible," she said. "You gave Matteo back his humanity. He was becoming as cold as the business required, losing himself to the violence and the politics. But you reminded him that there's more to life than power. You saved him in more ways than one." "We saved each other," Julia replied simply. The marriage, the real marriage that grew from their contract, became something of a legend in Naples. People spoke of the waitress who broke the Santoro curse, who walked into danger with nothing but courage, and emerged with a love story that challenged every expectation. Young women working in restaurants and shops looked at Julia's story and saw a possibility. The powerful families in Naples's underworld saw it and learned that sometimes the most valuable alliances come from the most unexpected places. Matteo transformed as well. He began to shift the Santoro family's business toward more legitimate enterprises, using his power to improve conditions in the neighborhoods where his family had once only extracted profit. He established a foundation in the names of his 3 deceased wives, providing support for women and children in need. And he loved Julia with the kind of fierce devotion that made even his most hardened men smile. When their first child was born, a daughter with her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair, they named her Alessandra Sofia Santoro, honoring both the wife Matteo had lost and the sister who had brought them together. She grew up knowing that she came from 2 worlds, from power and from perseverance, and that both were valuable. 2 years later, a son arrived, named Antonio after Matteo's father, and the villa filled with the sounds of children's laughter for the first time in generations. Julia never forgot where she came from. She continued to visit the Bella Vita, now as a patron rather than a waitress, and she made sure that the children of the neighborhood had opportunities she had lacked. She and Sophia, now fully recovered and studying to become a doctor, established a scholarship fund for young people whose families couldn't afford higher education. The Santoro name, once associated only with fear and power, began to carry a different meaning: redemption, love, and the strength that comes from choosing mercy over vengeance. On the anniversary of their first wedding, Matteo took Julia back to the chapel where they had spoken those initial, emotionless vows. They stood together in the candlelight, remembering the strangers they had been, the contract they had signed, and the journey that had brought them to love. "I would do it all again," Julia said, her hand in his. "Every terrifying moment, every dangerous decision. Because it led me here, to you, to this life we've built." "So would I," Matteo agreed. "You were supposed to be a solution to a problem, a contract to fulfill a duty. Instead, you became everything. My wife, my partner, my love. You broke more than a curse, Julia. You broke me open and taught me how to be whole again." They kissed in the chapel, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promise of the future. 2 people from completely different worlds who had found in each other exactly what they needed. Outside, Naples stretched out before them, ancient and modern, violent and beautiful, a city of contradictions where a waitress could become a queen and a mafia boss could learn to love. The story of the curse had a final chapter written that night, one that the people of Naples would tell for generations. It wasn't a story of tragedy or doom, of powerful men and doomed women. It was a story of courage, of a woman who risked everything to save her sister and found love in the most dangerous of places. It was a story of redemption, of a man who learned that true strength lies not in inspiring fear but in protecting those you love. And it was a story of transformation, of how love, when it's real and hard-fought and honestly earned, can break any curse and rewrite any destiny. As they left the chapel together, walking out into the warm Italian night, Julia looked up at the stars and thought of that terrified girl who had knocked a poisoned glass from a bride's hand. She had been invisible then, just another face in the crowd, just another woman struggling to survive in a world that rarely noticed people like her. But she had chosen to act, to be brave, to step forward when every instinct told her to stay silent and unseen. And that single moment of courage had changed everything, not just for her, but for everyone she loved. The curse of the Santoro brides was broken, not by superstition or magic, but by truth and justice and the fierce determination of a woman who refused to be just another victim. And in its place grew something far more powerful, a love story that proved that even in the darkest places, even surrounded by danger and deception, two people could find each other and choose, every day, to be brave together. And that, my dear friends, was the story of Julia and Matteo, of curses broken and love found in the most unexpected of places. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the fear and the hope along with them, I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment telling me what you thought, and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed the journey. Subscribe to Manuela's Story Library if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, tales of romance and danger, of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, of love that conquers even the darkest obstacles. Until next time, remember that courage doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you choose to act anyway, to fight for what you love, to believe in happy endings even when the world tells you they're impossible. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.